Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Joel Simon. I'm the Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and CPJ is delighted to co-sponsor this discussion about the dissident, along with the Knight First Amendment Institute and Columbia Global Freedom of Expression. And let me also thank the filmmakers, including Director Brian Fogel, for their support in making this evening's discussion possible. So you're here because you've had a chance to watch The Dissident, so I'm sure you will all concur that it is a riveting documentary. But I think that it's something much more than that, which is that it is a tool for justice. And this is a movie that is fueling conversations like this one, raising awareness across the country and around the world. But what you're going to hear tonight is not just another conversation, because we have with us some of the most important protagonists in this incredible story. The story of Jamal Khashoggi is, of course, dispiriting and heartbreaking in so many ways. But here's the point I want to make. It's a story that's not over. The people you will be hearing from tonight are helping to lead the fight for justice in Jamal's murder and pushing back against the stifling surveillance that put us all at risk. In recent weeks, there's been some progress towards justice, and you'll be hearing about that shortly. At CPJ, we are proud to stand shoulder to shoulder in this fight in what is perhaps the defining press freedom struggle of our time. And now I'm delighted to turn things over to Jamil Jaffer, the director of the Knight Institute, one of our partners in tonight's program, and also the moderator for tonight's discussion. Jamil, it's all yours.
Thank you, Joel, and thanks to all of you for joining us. The killing of Jamal Khashoggi was a terrible crime. It was also a singular insult to press freedom. I hope that many of you had the chance to see the film, which I think manages to convey Khashoggi's courage, the ruthlessness of his murder, and also the determination of some of the advocates and experts who have been trying to ensure that those responsible are held accountable. We are incredibly lucky to have two of those experts with us tonight. Agnès Callamard is the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions. She's also the director of Columbia's Global Freedom of Expression project. In her capacity as Special Rapporteur, she produced an exhaustive and meticulously researched report about the Khashoggi killing, which she presented to the UN Human Rights Council in the summer of 2019. We'll be talking a little bit about that report. With Columbia University's president, Lee Bollinger, she is the editor of Regardless of Frontiers, a just published collection of essays about freedom of expression around the world. Agnès, thank you very much for joining us. Our second guest is Ron Deibert. He's a professor of political science and director of the Citizen Lab at University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. No one has done more than he has to expose rights-abusing regimes' use of new technology to persecute journalists, dissidents, and activists. He too has a new book. It's called Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society. So we have a little bit less than an hour, which is not a lot of time. I'm gonna ask Agnès, Ron, and maybe Joel a couple of questions, and then we'll take questions from the floor. Agnès, let me start with you. You published your report about the Khashoggi killing more than 18 months ago. Mm-hmm. You were dealing with intelligence services whose statements you couldn't trust, with powerful authoritarian governments that didn't want to cooperate with your inquiry or didn't want to cooperate fully anyway. President Trump was doing everything he could to protect the Saudi regime. Can you talk about some of the challenges that you had to deal with in your investigation? And maybe also about some of the key conclusions that you reached?
Thank you very much, Jamil. It's a pleasure to be here today. The challenges, I don't know. I'm not sure we have enough time for the hour, but I'll just maybe present a couple of them. First of all, at both an empirical and methodological level, as you pointed out, a lot of information regarding the killing of Jamal Khashoggi was held, and indeed is still held, by intelligence agencies. And working with intelligence as opposed to working with criminal evidence, or indeed evidence regarding state responsibilities, poses a number of challenges, one of which is, can you trust your source? Because it's very difficult to scrutinize the intelligence, and indeed almost impossible to directly access the source. So I did have there particular problems. I found ways of working with it and around it, but it was not straightforward. A second issue was resources. The United Nations did not provide me with resources to conduct my investigation, very little, just support for 5 days in Turkey, and everything else I actually ended up covering myself, and subsequently finding NGOs in particular prepared to reimburse me for the cost I had incurred. I relied a great deal on pro bono support. I had fantastic people who were willing to spare their time working on that investigation for free. So we managed to do something, I think, which is quite extraordinary together. But I will certainly recommend that moving forward, if we wanted to have more investigation into targeted killings of journalists, that we find ways of resourcing those initiatives a bit better. And then, of course, there were the third challenge is one of security for my informants, for witnesses, because as we know, the people responsible for the killing of Jamal have now, it's becoming clear, a long history of act of violence, including extraterritorial. I needed to also find ways of setting up security mechanisms for my own communication, and then ultimately for me personally. There were many accusations of biases, many disinformations within social media, particularly in the Middle East. So all of that made for a difficult environment. But as I said, I think we conducted a very technically sound and focused investigation. We worked on the basis of a legal framework, which was first human rights based, but we also used international criminal element for individual liability. We collected our evidence and so on and so forth. The findings are well known, I think, by now.
Agnès, can I just interrupt you? I want to ask you one question about which I'm not sure you'll be able to answer, but it's first of all amazing that you were able to do something like this with the challenges that you just described. And the report really is incredibly well researched and meticulously done. But why was this left to you? The United Nations is an organization with immense resources. Why is it that this inquiry was conducted by a special rapporteur?
Well, because no one else was prepared to do it. From October to December, there were a number of actors, I think, including Joël, including myself, calling for an international investigation. The special rapporteur of freedom of expression, David Cade, at the time also called for an international investigation. Civil society did. But there was no move into that direction. The Secretary General was hiding behind procedures Turkey was prepared to state that they wanted an international investigation, but was not prepared to act in that direction, i.e. to issue an actual request, written request to the UN, and no other states was prepared to move with that. I was the only one within the overall international system who had the mandate to determine that I could conduct that investigation. I did not need anyone to tell me to do it or to stop me from doing it. It is part of, it's a beauty of special procedures. Mm-hmm. We are a little bit part of the UN, but we are also very much independent. And it is incumbent upon us to determine how we want to use that independence. And it was clear to me by mid-December or the third week of December when I said to myself, right, if no one else is going to do it, I'm going to do it.
Well, I'm glad you did. I think that the world owes you an immense debt of gratitude. It's really important. I interrupted you when you were going to talk about your findings. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, the key finding, the first one is that this was a state crime. It was an extrajudicial executions conducted by the state. It was premeditated. It was resourced and organized by state officials. It was conducted in a state agency, the consulate of Saudi Arabia. All members of the killing team but one were security personnel very close to or indeed working within the court. There is evidence coming from Saudi Arabia itself that very high-level officials in Saudi Arabia met with the team before it left for Istanbul. And today we have learned from, thanks to CNN investigation, that the private jet that brought a large number of the team members, those private jets are owned by a public fund, which is chaired by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So all in all, there is absolutely no doubt that under international law, what we are looking at now is not a rogue operation, as they keep insisting, but it is a state execution conducted, resourced, organized by the state of Saudi Arabia. The role of the state is compounded or is further demonstrated by what happened after the killing, which is that for 14 days, Saudi Arabia officials were present on their own in the crime scene, that is a Saudi consulate, and everything tend to show that during that time they did not collect evidence, but they actually cleaned the crime scene, so that by the time the Turkish investigation team finally managed to go to the crime scene, there was almost nothing to be found. So that's in a nutshell some of those findings: lack of accountability afterwards, the focus on the lowest level element, no determination, inclination to focus on the chain of command, to focus on the mastermind, including the Crown Prince, who all have escaped accountability.
And yes, you have recited these findings so many times that you say them in a kind of matter-of-fact tone. But the facts here are astounding and truly outrageous. I mean, I don't know if there's any precedent for the senior-most officials of a regime to order and carry out this kind of killing abroad, not just abroad, but in their own consulate. Of a journalist for the crime of having criticized the regime or participated in what they saw as advocacy against the regime is truly outrageous. But I want to leave that for a second and go to Ron. Ron, the film is, as you know, in part about the Saudi regime's use of spyware supplied by an Israeli company, NSO Group, to monitor and intimidate political dissidents. I want to ask you about what your investigations uncovered. But I also want to ask you sort of a slightly broader question. The Saudis aren't the only ones using this kind of technology. And NSO Group is not the only company peddling spyware to authoritarian regimes. Can you talk a little bit about that broader landscape as well?
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Jamil. And thank you, Agnès, again, for your amazing report. It's interesting, right now we're at the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring, and I like to situate that event next to the question you asked, because while most of the world was looking at those events as a symbol of the potential power of digital technologies, social media to help mobilize people, most of the world's autocrats and authoritarian regimes were looking upon it and drawing a completely different lesson. They were saying, how do we prevent something like this from ever happening to us? And they went out and found a very willing collection of firms in the surveillance industry to equip them with tools, products, and services they never before imagined, including the type of spyware that we have documented extensively at the Citizen Lab. So the fact of the matter is that this marketplace is growing. It's very lucrative. It capitalizes on the fact that the personal data surveillance economy already is invasive by design, insecure, poorly regulated, and prone to abuse. So you have all of this data exhaust everywhere, and you have everyone carrying around with them devices in their pockets that are architected to extract as much data as they can from them. And meanwhile, you have governments that want to get access to that data. Most of the companies that operate in this space do so under the cover of selling something legitimate. They say that we are providing tools that are necessary for law enforcement, for intelligence agencies to investigate various serious matters of crime and terrorism. The problem is that we have shown in our research time and time again is that most of the governments that purchase this technology have a very broad definition of what constitutes a criminal or a terrorist. And most of that includes journalists, includes human rights defenders, includes lawyers, includes most of us on this panel for that matter. And the companies, meanwhile, have paid lip service to putting in place checks and balances to do some kind of due diligence around how their clients use their very powerful technologies. But the reality is these are not meaningful. They're looking to capitalize on this growing marketplace, and there's an endless appetite. Some of the examples from our research are really quite astonishing. So let me give you one example from a completely different case and another company. We did a report in 2017 where we discovered that Ethiopia, one of the poorest countries in the world, with less than, 15% internet penetration, could, thanks to an Israeli company called Cyberbit, mount a global cyber espionage operation. I mean, this is mind-blowing stuff. They could go out and just purchase their own NSA-style capabilities thanks to a company like Cyberbit. These companies are providing surveillance as a service, if you will. And the consequences are highly significant, as we saw in the Jamal Khashoggi case, often lethal. Even if they don't actually end up hacking the devices of dissidents or human rights advocates or journalists or whatever, the reality is right now, based on the cases that have come to light, a huge chilling effect is sweeping over civil society. People are aware of these capabilities. They're afraid to click on links, to use the internet, to use email, because they're concerned that maybe their friends' devices have been hacked or my device has been hacked. Beyond that, it's slowed everything down, of course. So if you, again, the contrast with the Arab Spring is so significant here. People were using social media, instant messaging applications, email applications to organize and mobilize. Now it's like sand has been put in the machinery of all of this equipment and technology because of the fear and the climate of concern around surveillance that has spread widely on top of actually existing capabilities that enable these governments to do what they're doing.
Ron, is there some way to hold spyware manufacturers accountable for the foreseeable use of their products by authoritarian regimes? Have you seen, any efforts in that direction? Anything that looks, remotely effective?
Well, I will say it's pretty bleak right now, and part of most people, they think about some kind of international regulation. Unfortunately, most governments have a stake in this game. That's the dirty secret here. The Canadas of the world, certainly the United States of the world, France, etc., United Kingdom, they're all part of this marketplace. And they, the uncomfortable, the painful truth here, as much as they may pay lip service to the human rights abuses that we have documented and which were manifest in the Khashoggi execution, they are unwilling to take concerted action because it cuts at something that's very important for their self-interest, which is this marketplace. A lot of the companies, frankly, have their origins in the West. They service the cybersecurity industry, and then they started spreading their wares to other willing clients around the world. So the long-term prospect here maybe is optimistic, but in the short, medium term, highly unlikely, which is why the report that Agnès did, and also the report by David Kay, where he called for a moratorium on the sale of this type of spyware, was so very important. If only for rhetorical reasons, we can say something needs to be done. Meanwhile, you do see some movements in fits and starts. Europe, I would say, is leading the way in terms of at least discussing serious export controls. Of course, the problem is that not all of these companies will be European. And, NSO Group, the company at the heart of the case that we're discussing, actually goes through export controls. All of their sales are vetted by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And probably because they benefit by having an Israeli company involved in signals intelligence globally, they simply rubber stamp every export. So government controls are not very promising. Litigation, though, in the short term, I think may have some effect. And here's why. So after a recent episode of exploits involving NSO's latest version of Pegasus, which took advantage of an exploit in WhatsApp to engage in no-click attacks and exploits where there was no interaction on the user, simply take over a phone by ringing it up. WhatsApp and Facebook have sued NSO Group. The litigation is ongoing. Microsoft, other tech companies have enjoined that lawsuit. Many advocacy groups have written amici in support of that. If there are serious consequences, financial penalties, let's say, shareholders who are involved in these companies, because it is a very lucrative industry, may say, okay, we need to curb some of this inappropriate, reckless abuse behavior. I'm not holding out hope for that, but I think it's certainly possible. So basically that leaves us, when I say us, civil society, largely on our own. We have to build up our own capacity, our own awareness, which is one of the reasons why the research that Citizen Lab does and Amnesty International does with their security lab is so very important. We need to raise awareness that this is going on, first of all, so that targeted groups can understand digital security is a very serious risk. We need to make sure that we're standing up our organizations in a way that takes into account all that we can do to protect ourselves. Even though some of the latest attacks, honestly, there's very little defense against it. So powerful is this technology.
Thanks, Ron. Agnès, I want to ask you about a sort of different aspect of, we were just talking about accountability for spyware manufacturers. I want to talk about accountability for the people who were behind the Khashoggi killing in particular. So you call for accountability at the end of your report, and I'm interested to know how much progress you think that we've made. The US, as you know, has sanctioned, I think it's 17 people under the Global Magnitsky Act. The Saudis have prosecuted some of those people and convicted them. Should we see that as progress, and what else needs to be done?
Well, the people that have been indicted, charged, and sentenced in Saudi Arabia are, as I have said, are really those that are at the lowest level of the chain of command. And it is not to excuse them at all. They were the hitmen, and they need to be held accountable for what they've done. And it appears as if Saudi Arabia did hold them to account to a certain extent. On the other hand, we cannot be giving a seal of approval to the process followed by Saudi Arabia. It was lacking, and I'm talking here about the trial, it was lacking in transparency. The identity of those charged and sentenced has never been made public. It brought in representatives of the P5, members of the Security Council, meaning that they, by extension, became complicit in what is clearly a miscarriage of justice in terms of due process. So even though we need to welcome the fact that the hitmen have been found identified and found guilty, that clearly what happened in Saudi Arabia is clearly the demonstration that this kind of process and trial is far from being sufficient and is not something that we should support.
And there were observers, right? Sorry, and yes, but there were observers at the trial, but they were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. Did I get that right?
I mean, it's complete. It's frankly, that's why I said that they made themselves complicit in a miscarriage of justice. I think it is really something we need to call them on. It is unacceptable. But moving on from that particular issue, the mastermind have not been identified, they have not been worried, they have not been charged, and they have not been investigated. During the trials, a number of individuals were actually initially part of the trial, and then they were let go or let free at the outcome of the process. One individual in particular, Saud al-Qahtani, who is a right-hand man of Mohammed bin Salman and someone who has been directly named by the prosecutor as inciting the killing team before it left. That person has not even been brought into the trial and has not been charged, and certainly is, last I heard, walking freely in the streets of Riyadh. And the killing of Jamal Khashoggi is only one of a plethora of violations that this individual has committed. So from that standpoint, there has not been any accountability yet. On the other hand, we have to recognize a few things. First of all, only a very naive person would have hoped and would have expected the Saudi judicial system to deliver accountability. And which, in that context, I think what civil society has done, what Hatice Cengiz has done, what I hope I have contributed to do, is a very important part of the journey for justice, because justice is not an outcome. We must be very clear for that. It's not an outcome in the case of Jamal, and it's not an outcome in any case. It's a journey. And on that journey, if you look at it as a journey, then all we can say that we have progressed in the right direction. We have not let go. We have not let the issue fall off the agenda. We have kept MBS in particular in the center of the storytelling. And we have kept hammering that for the sake of accountability and for the sake of American democracy, the DNI report must be released. And I want here to welcome the statement by Avril Haines when she was interviewed for the position of director, when she said, I will do it because it is the law. And, you know, I think we have progressed in the right direction. Hopefully tomorrow there will be more information about the personal responsibility of Mohammed bin Salman and others for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And once we have further evidence, it will be really impossible for the rest of the world to ignore whatever information will be provided.
Thanks, Agnès. I want to make sure that everybody listening knows what you're referring to when you talk about further evidence. So there was a report that the Director of National Intelligence put together a couple of years ago about the killing. It was unlawfully withheld by the Trump administration, but the Biden administration may release it in the next couple of days. I want to ask, maybe starting with Joel, a question about that, and then I'm going to go to questions from the floor. Joel, what can the Biden administration do beyond releasing the Director of National Intelligence's report to repair the damage that has been done over the last few years to press freedom and to make the U.S., you know, an ally to journalists and activists who are surveilled and intimidated and persecuted by rights-abusing regimes?
Yeah, well, let's first acknowledge the role of the Khashoggi murder in shaping perceptions globally about the commitment of the United States to press freedom and to the safety, security of journalists around the world. The Trump administration, and Trump in particular, as you and I have talked about, Jamil, became an accessory after the fact to the crime. It basically participated, not basically, it did participate in the cover-up. So that shaped perceptions of, or reinforced perceptions, because obviously President Trump had created them through his rhetoric and the language that he used, the enemies of the people and fake news, which were incorporated and appropriated by autocratic governments around the world to justify their own crackdowns. And then they saw that when a leading journalist, a columnist for the Washington Post, a US resident, was brutally murdered by a US ally, and that crime, thanks to, in part, but certainly there were other efforts to expose what occurred, but certainly Agnès deserves tremendous credit for exposing that crime. And when that occurred, what was the response of the US government? And Trump in particular, well, I shouldn't say the US government, Trump in particular, was to protect MBS and to say something that I think shocked the conscience, which was that the strategic and commercial relationship was much more important than any principle. So I think that there are a lot of things that the Biden administration could do, and there's a long list. We actually have a white paper that we produced at CPJ, and we've called on President Biden to make a major speech about the importance of press freedom, to defend press freedom domestically, to speak out publicly about the important role that journalists play in a democratic society, to incorporate press freedom into US foreign policy, even to appoint a special envoy of the State Department who would actually have the responsibility of defending press freedom around the world and standing up for these principles. All of those things are important, but none of them will matter if the Biden administration does not commit and demonstrate that justice matters, and that it will put the life of this journalist and the principle that is at stake before any other consideration in the relationship with Saudi Arabia. That's certainly something we would like to see.
Ron or Agnès, either of you have anything to add on that question?
I do, actually. I will say this. We, as you know, I think, and was illustrated for those of you who watched the documentary, we discovered that Saudi Arabia was spying on a Canadian permanent resident, Omar Abdulaziz, in the course of our investigations into NSO spyware. We released our report on October 1st, 2018. I had no idea that Omar and Jamal Khashoggi were even colleagues until the next day when Jamal Khashoggi was executed, and Omar sent me a text saying, Jamal has gone missing. I'm very concerned. I was like, what is going on here? Of course, the incident was covered widely in the news, but the fact that we uncovered Saudi Arabia using Israeli technology to spy on a Canadian permanent resident, and the Canadian government has to this date not condemned that or even acknowledged, other than say, kind of vaguely that we're aware of this report, to me is astonishing. And it's just emblematic of what I'm talking about before, that the governments are unwilling to really step up and say something about this for a variety of reasons, not just that they're implicated in global signals intelligence, part of this marketplace, but it has to do with the geopolitics of the situation in the case of Canada. I really think it's time for Canada to step up on this issue. It's one, clearly in contradiction to our stated values. Canada is home to a lot of refugees, immigrants who come to this country. And as we know, transnational repression of this sort is on the rise. If we want to advertise ourselves as a country that is in favor of human rights, that welcomes people who are at risk like this, we better stand up when it counts and say that this is not acceptable in our country, and actually go further than that and take some action collectively with other countries to control this dangerous, largely unregulated commercial surveillance industry that is only going to cause more incidents like this if it's left on its own, to the company's own volition. So I frankly, I'm disappointed in my own country in this regard.
Ron, as a Canadian citizen, I want to associate myself with your disappointment. Yeah, I think it's, I agree with you. It's terrible that the Canadian government hasn't done more or done anything, on this case or the broader set of issues here. We have a lot of great questions from the audience here. Some of which I think we have sort of covered already, but here's one that maybe you all may have something to say about. What can ordinary people do to push for justice in this case? And part of the answer I have a kind of related question, which is about the role of business leaders and civic leaders. In the weeks after the killing, there were business leaders and civic leaders who withdrew from Davos in the desert, which is the Saudi government's signature conference. And there was the sense, I think, that the Saudi regime and the Crown Prince in particular were being isolated. This year, the conference took place again, and all the people who didn't go 2 years ago went this year. Not just business leaders, but even a CNN journalist was there as a participant in the event. So maybe two questions here. Is there something that ordinary people can do to call for justice in this case? And also, do business and civic leaders have a role to play here?
Well, I think business leaders have a key role to play in, particularly in the case of Saudi Arabia. Corporate social accountability should mean something and should be put to good use whenever there is evidence that countries or that corporations are doing business with individuals that have blood on their hands. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, as we unfortunately know, everything related to trade and investment and business have to pass through either the Crown Prince or people associated with the Crown Prince. So whoever wants to do business in Saudi Arabia has to do business with the Crown Prince. Nevertheless, within that context, I think there are certain red lines that should not be crossed by those corporations. In my view, we've already heard that any kind of business product that may be used for the purpose of violating, repressing freedom of expression or other fundamental freedom, I mean, those corporations should desist from working with a government that is clearly going to put them to such use. I mean, information technology and surveillance technology is certainly one of them. Second, I am particularly keen to see the public relations firm, the communication firms, many of which have big offices in Riyadh. I think they certainly are becoming complicit in the construction and in the image of a country that has absolutely nothing to do with the reality. If they are being recruited to create messages whose actual function is to hide, is to silence, is to construct illusion regarding the countries, I think they certainly should desist from working in that country. So there are some red lines that should not be crossed, and the key one is my product going to contribute to repression? And if it is, then I should not do it. I should look to another place to doing my business. And when it comes to individuals, in my view, the most important demand and action that people in the United States, normal citizens, can do is call upon their representative to do the right thing, to vote on for instance, at the moment, Representative Schiff has put forward a proposal for the Jamal Khashoggi Act. It is something that I have also recommended in the past, and I'm recommending it to other countries. It's basically an act which would impose sanctions and a range of other actions on individuals who are participating to either the impunity for crimes against journalists or who are themselves involved in crimes against journalists. The adoption of the Jamal Khashoggi Act is a very important step, part of justice for Jamal and justice for other journalists around the world. If you are a citizen of the United States, write to your representative and demand that they take all necessary actions to protect freedom of the press domestically and internationally.
Joel or Ron, either of you want to add to that?
Nothing I could add that would be as eloquent as that. I would say I agree.
I don't think I'll be quite as eloquent, but I do want to add make one point, which is I think that people have done something important already, perhaps without even recognizing it, which is that they have cared. They have connected emotionally with Jamal and who he was and what he represented. I've been in the business of defending press freedom for a long time, and it can be really a struggle to get people to care, to get people to understand and appreciate what's at stake. And Jamal's case resonated in a way that I've never seen. And partially it was because the Washington Post got behind a really impressive and well-designed campaign, and they continue to call for justice and to insist that Jamal's memory be honored and that his contribution be recognized. But it is really unusual. And what Agnès has said, that Jamal is at the center of sort of public consciousness and public awareness, and that impacts US policy and impacts MBS's ability to function in the way that he would like to function at a global level. That's because people connected with Jamal and because they cared. And so I think we should ask people to continue to care and to continue to follow developments and continue to engage with the fight for justice.
Thanks, Joel. Okay, so I have a question here from an audience member. I think it's principally for you, Ron. Is there an ideological dimension to the marketplace of surveillance technologies? For instance, do Western companies and Chinese or Russian companies sell different kinds of technologies or service different clientele based on their ideological or geopolitical alignments? If so, will a digital Cold War emerge along these lines?
Well, that's a good question. I will say that, you know, every nation state that's involved in this has a slightly different flavor and character to how they undertake cyber espionage. It is a very large and lucrative marketplace that services many of these governments. A lot of the companies have shown, but demonstrated, that they don't really care to whom they're selling for the most part. So NSO Group, for example, dozens of clients around the world in every region, basically, of the world. I do believe, however, there's a lot we don't know about this marketplace. Even, you know, us as researchers, we spent a decade carefully mapping and monitoring this marketplace. There's a lot that we just don't know. And that's because of the inherent secrecy under which a lot of this activity takes place. So, for example, I said before that the Israeli Ministry of Defense issues export licenses for NSO's technology. NSO Group and many other Israeli surveillance companies are staffed by veterans of Israel's very formidable signals intelligence agency, Unit 8200. There is obviously things going on behind the scenes that we don't know about in terms of deals that are made or information sharing arrangements going on that cut at the core of the question that's being asked here. Obviously, countries use these technologies as part of their rivalries with their adversaries. And so there is an ideological division in that respect. But like I said, there's a lot that we just don't know because it's shrouded in secrecy.
Thanks, Ron. So this is a question I'm not sure that anybody's going to be able to truly answer, but I think it's a good question. I'm going to ask it. Basically, the question is, what was motivating Turkey in all of this? So Turkey is one of the world's leading persecutors of journalists, and you know, suddenly Turkey is in this position of you know, asserting the calling for justice for this high-profile Saudi journalist who was killed on Turkish soil or in a consulate in Turkey. What was in this for Turkey? Why did Turkey operate in the way that it did? Well, let me just leave it at that.
I can you know, try to provide the beginning of an answer. I mean, clearly, Turkey had a geostrategic interest in, and they used what they knew about the killings in ways that served those interests. There is no doubt that they extracted a great deal of international attention through the way they very carefully, skillfully, some will say, distributed information bit by bit to the international community. They actually played a major role in ensuring that the issue was kept on the international agenda through their skillful mastering of the information that they had. One thing I have noted when I was in Turkey, and I've been there several times for my investigation, is that there was more to it than all of that. And maybe also certainly the attempt to hide their own record and to demonstrate that they can do the right thing. It was very clear to me during my investigation that the Turkish officials I met, including at the highest level, were deeply angered by what had happened on their territory. They were deeply angered by the fact that Saudi Arabia had tried to put the blame on Turkey. They were deeply shocked by the way the killing team conducted its operation. They were probably pretty pissed off that they failed to stop the team before it went into action in the consulate, unlike, for instance, Canadians who managed to stop those teams here in advance. So there is a real sense of national honor having to be somehow revenged in that context. So I'm not saying that it was a main driver, but I certainly think it was there alongside the more cynical instrumentalization of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, which undoubtedly was very present.
Joel, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would add is that I actually had a chance to ask Brian Fogel the same question, because he obviously got, in making this film, which one of the elements that make it so powerful is the cooperation that he got from Turkish officials involved in the investigation, who went on camera and spoke about their investigations. So I asked him, and he mentioned some of the same considerations that Agnès mentioned, that he heard this anger and this kind of wounded national pride. But I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is Erdogan's vision of Turkey as a regional power that's formidable and should not be trifled with. And so I think part of that was asserting that authority with Saudi Arabia, and with MBS in particular, who this is according to Brian's interpretation, Erdogan viewed as like an upstart and a hothead, and he wanted to also send a signal to him. And I think it is important to keep in mind, the deeply, and as Agnès mentioned, what we know about what occurred is as a result of Turkish intelligence and also their investigations and the information that they trickled out, and as Agnès mentioned, in a very sophisticated way that kept the story alive. But Turkey is highly repressive. It's one of the world's leading jailers of journalists. It's certainly not motivated by any love for press freedom or for Jamal Khashoggi, and I think that is something that we have to keep front and center in considering their role.
So we probably have time for just one more question, and this is a difficult one, I think. So let's assume that the Director of National Intelligence's report, which hopefully will be out in the next few days, says what many people think it's going to say, and it says that the U.S. intelligence community came to the conclusion almost 2 years ago that the Crown Prince authorized this killing, or it says something along those lines. What prospect is there for accountability with respect to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia? It's not like he can be hauled into court in Istanbul or New York City or anywhere else. What does accountability look like?
It won't look like him facing a court immediately, that we know for sure, and we need to keep asking for it. But again, I want to repeat, we cannot be held hostage by a Turkey highly problematic judicial system. We have to find other paths for justice and other narrative for our own understanding of justice. So the first form of justice for me will be that Mohammed bin Salman is banned from the international arena. that basically he cannot travel abroad except in a few number of countries that are prepared to set aside the evidence provided regarding his authorization of a killing, that he cannot travel, that he cannot represent his country, I think does mean in the short, medium and long term that he is not fit for the purpose of being the next king. That's simple. And that frankly will be tremendous justice for Jamal.
Yeah, I agree with Agnès. I think that, you know, accountability is obviously going to be imperfect and kind of sideways here, but that doesn't mean that there can't be any, exactly as she describes, especially if he is marginalized in international fora, which of course depends on the governments themselves making that decision, which I'm not holding out hope for. But if they do, then that may jeopardize his position internally in Saudi Arabia. If it becomes unsustainable for him to be a senior representative of the Saudi regime, his position internally may be at risk.
Yeah, and I think just to end on a note of I don't know if I call it optimism, but at least some sort of recognition of what has been achieved. And yes, I don't know if you'll recall when you decided to do this, that we had a phone conversation. I think I was in some restaurant or something, and the phone rang, and you called, and you mentioned you were going to take this on. I have to say, I was somewhat skeptical because I just didn't know what would be possible. And we actually had this discussion. I said, you know, what does justice look like? And you said, it's not going to be justice, it's going to be accountability. And I was, you know, I was supportive. I think you will acknowledge, and I was behind you at every step, but I was also a little bit skeptical. So let's acknowledge what's been achieved. Let's recognize that just how difficult, almost unimaginable this was when Agnès started this investigation, and where we've come. So there is hope. I mean, I don't know, maybe because I lack imagination, exactly what accountability is going to look like. But I think we should recognize that if this is sort of a long and winding path, you know, we've come some measure along that path already. And that's thanks to Agnès, but to so many other people who have fought so tenaciously for justice and accountability.
Absolutely. Well said.
I think the film, I thought the film was enlightening in many different ways, but one of the things that really comes across is the courage that you, Agnès, and Ron, that you sort of demonstrate daily through your work. And I know that I speak probably for everybody in the audience in saying thank you to both of you for the work you've been doing and the work that you will continue to do. I want to add just one point. Earlier, somebody in the audience asked, what can ordinary people do? There is one other thing that ordinary people can do, and that is support organizations like Citizen Lab and Amnesty and the Committee to Protect Journalists, which all do truly extraordinary and necessary work in protecting press freedom and in protecting human rights activists who face the same kind of threats that Jamal Khashoggi did. So if you're in a position to support them, then please do. So let me leave it at that. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Joel and Ron and Agnès, for being here today, and again for all of your work.
Thank you, Jamil.
Thank you, Jamil.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
So much. Good
Thank
night.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.